The great modern masters of suspicion especially tended to assume that any accurate etiology of religion would lead back ultimately to this sort of pathetic human longing for some kind of compensation beyond the grave, some final reward or release from suffering, and that the religious impulse in human cultures rises principally from a deeply felt social, psychological need to make the burdens of existence more tolerable and the fear of death less agonizing. Marx said that religion was essentially the heart of a heartless world, the breath of pity in a universe of anguish, the tender opiate that soothes the misery of suffering and hopeless humanity. It's actually a very tender passage in Marx. It's not actually a denunciation of religion. He just saw it as the sad outcry of alienated humanity, which had to be overcome by creating social justice. As such, it will necessarily vanish as social alienation is progressively overcome. For classical Marxist theory, this is a structural judgment upon religion as an established, observable institution, but it's also something Marx is saying that's where he thinks religion came from. Freud also regarded religion as an illusion that will or should, in the fullness of time, melt away. And he said over and over and over again that the origin of religion was principally the fear of death. And this wasn't a daring speculation or outlandish. It was a natural extrapolation from the experience of some of the sort of middle-class religion he saw about him in Vienna. And yet, that said, Marx and Freud and those who agree with them on this point were and are most certainly wrong. Keep playing with this. Strange as it may seem, the textual, historical, and archaeological evidence clearly shows us that the religious impulse in human society, which is everywhere, has no clear connection at all with hope in an afterlife. Systems of faith vary, of course, from culture to culture, but when we examine the beliefs of early civilizations anywhere in the world, we find that only a small minority of them had any concrete notion of a meaningful life beyond this one. And practically none imagined that if there were such a life, it was open to any but a very special few. Most ancient cultures had some vague concept of a kind of post-mortem persistence, a sort of shadowy, spectral half-existence beyond death, a dark, barren, joyless, pointless underworld or otherworld. Very few thought that death would bring a happier existence. The Hebrew Bible, for instance, the Old Testament contains no real promises of afterlife or resurrection until very late in its pages. In fact, since you're, I think, all Protestants, very few such promises at all. I'm Eastern Orthodox, so we have books in our version of the Old Testament that have slightly later, more pleasant eschatological visions, perhaps. But you all had to wait for the New Testament, so from this on. At least until the apocalyptic period, there's not really any firm, there's beginning to take shape, but until the apocalyptic period, we don't have very firm concepts of a recompense for the righteous beyond death. For the better part of the Hebrew Bible, death is simply the end for great and small, righteous and wicked alike. What awaits us beyond this world is Sheol, a sort of abyss in which impalpable shadows of ourselves linger on amid the dust and the darkness. To die is to be cut off from the land of the living, and so to be cut off from God permanently, and one lives past death in the generations of one's children. The same is true of most ancient Greek religion, if art and myth are to be believed. If you've read the Iliad, as I hope you have, you may notice that when the warriors die on the field of battle, their souls depart for Hades squealing like bats, miserable and hopeless. And in the Odyssey, when Odysseus, at the end of the Odyssey, of course, there's that pathetic procession of the slain suitors being led away by Hermes in his office as divine Psychopompus Psychopompous, yeah, sounds kind of... it means one who leads the soul into the afterlife, not a description of me. But again, in the Odyssey, there's the famous visit to Hades by Odysseus, and and everyone, great and small alike, is there, and the desolate, thirsty phantoms who dwell there are summoned, are tempted with sheep's blood poured in a trench. And Odysseus meets the ghost of great Achilles himself, who tells him that it would be better to live the meanest life of the most wretched man upon the face of the earth than to be king over all the dead. Now, you can take into account the Pythagorean, Platonic, Orphic doctrines of developed Greek thought which had an idea of the immortal soul, but we can still say that the indigenous religious consciousness of Hellenic culture was not animated by anything like an anticipation of eternal life. Or you can look at ancient Mesopotamia, the Epic of Gilgamesh, the death of Enkidu, the friend of Gilgamesh, describing the house of dust, which is what he calls the land below. Or Gilgamesh himself desperately seeking eternal life, going to speak to Utnapishtim, the Akkadian Sumerian Noah, to secure from him the secret of endless life, but he doesn't get it because the plant that might have given him long life is devoured by a serpent when he is washing himself. And he simply has to return to his home, the mighty city of Uruk, and take consolation in the greatness of the wall he has built there. And yet all of these cultures and others like them were profoundly religious. In every sense, they worshipped and served their god or gods with offerings, hymns, prayers. They built temples. They erected altars. They believed in a divine realm and in transcendent powers. They were not materialist in the sense that we would use that word today in their conception of human existence. But manifestly, to be religious is not necessarily to imagine that death is anything but final. So, there's no such thing as religion in the abstract, but throughout the better part of human history, to the degree that there has been, it hasn't been a happy phenomenon in any number of ways. This is not to deny that there is a relation at the profoundest level between the human consciousness of death and religious practice and belief. It's only to say that this relation is not a sort of mechanical connection between rational misery and irrational hope, the way Marx and Freud and others believed it was.